Somewhere in your kitchen right now, there is a food that has quietly controlled human behavior for 12,000 years, and you have never once questioned it. Bread, rice, cereal, pasta. Grain touches almost everything you eat today, and grain is also the reason humans built cities, kings, taxes, and prisons. We call the moment humans started farming the agricultural revolution, taught in school as the moment life finally got easier. But a growing pile of bones, buried for thousands of years, tells a very different story, and it starts with the question nobody wants to ask out loud. Around 12,000 years ago, in a region called the Fertile Crescent, stretching through modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, families began deliberately planting seeds. At a site called Abu Huraira, in modern Syria, archaeologists found some of the earliest physical evidence of that shift, preserved directly in human bone. It was not a single decision, not an invention, not a moment anyone would have recognized as history happening around them. There was no meeting, no leader, no announcement. Just families, repeating small choices, generation after generation, without knowing where it would lead. For tens of thousands of years before anyone farmed, wild cereals already grew thick around the seasonal camps where foragers returned year after year. Human waste, trampled soil, and repeated harvesting quietly favored certain plants over others, long before anyone understood they were shaping evolution itself. Grain was adapting to people before people ever decided to adapt to grain, a slow drift nobody was steering, and nobody could see happening. It took thousands of years before the drift became a decision, and thousands more before anyone questioned whether that decision helped us. In 1987, one scientist finally asked the question directly, in an essay that appended how historians talked about the origins of civilization. So was farming really humanity's great leap forward? The answer spans 12,000 years, several continents, a mountain of bones, and one very uncomfortable essay. Let's start with the myth almost everyone believes without ever checking it, that farming rescued humans from a desperate, hungry existence. The image in most people's heads is a starving forager, one bad hunt away from death, saved by the invention of the field. In 1966, anthropologists studying the Juhonsi San people of the Kalahari Desert found something that didn't match that image at all. Researcher Richard Lee spent months timing exactly how many hours the group spent finding food, and the number stunned him. On average, they worked roughly 15 to 20 hours a week gathering and hunting, far less than a typical modern work week. The rest of their time went to rest, storytelling, and social life, a lifestyle anthropologist Marshall Sahlins later called, provocatively, the original affluent society. Compare that to early farmers, who spent nearly every daylight hour clearing, planting, weeding, guarding, harvesting, and grinding, just to stay fed. The myth said farming created leisure. The evidence said something closer to the opposite, and that contradiction is where the story really begins. So how do scientists know what ancient bodies actually went through? They read it directly in bone, teeth, and chemical traces left behind. Stress marks called Harris lines form in growing bones during periods of malnutrition or illness, leaving a kind of biological diary inside the skeleton. Pitted, spongy bone on the skull, called porotic hyperostosis, often signals anemia, frequently linked to iron-poor, grain-heavy diets. Worn, cavity-riddled teeth reveal a diet high in starchy carbohydrates, the opposite of the varied wild diet foragers typically ate. None of this requires guesswork. It's chemistry and biology. Read directly from remains buried for thousands of years, and the pattern is remarkably consistent. Here's the second myth worth clearing up: the idea that farming was a brilliant idea, invented once, by someone clever enough to see the future. That story imagines a single genius, staring at a seed, suddenly realizing it could be planted on purpose to guarantee food forever. The real record shows something messier. Agriculture emerged independently in at least 7 separate regions: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and beyond. Each region domesticated different plants: wheat and barley in the Middle East, rice and millet in China, maize in Mesoamerica, with no contact between them. That independent repetition is actually the most convincing evidence that farming wasn't a stroke of genius at all, but a trap almost any settled group eventually fell into. Given the right plants, the right climate, and enough time near one place, it seems the shift toward farming was close to inevitable. Long before full farming, a culture called the Natufians lived across the Levant, harvesting wild grain with stone sickles as early as 12,500 BC. Archaeologist Andrew Moore, who excavated Abu Huraira in the 1970s, found grinding stones worn smooth from what must have been thousands of repetitive hours. The skeletons buried nearby told the same story. Toe bones showed a distinctive deformity, later linked to hours spent kneeling to grind grain by hand. Knees, spines, and lower backs showed arthritis at ages far younger than expected. Physical evidence of the specific motion of grinding, day after day. This wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was a slow accumulation of small physical costs, repeated so many times they eventually reshaped human bodies. A single grinding session might feel unremarkable. Multiply it by 3 meals a day, for years, across a whole community, and the toll becomes visible in stone. That toll is exactly what the myth of easy farming leaves out of the textbook version of this story. But here's where the trap really tightens, and it has almost nothing to do with individual choice. Farming let women have children closer together, since a settled camp didn't require carrying every toddler for miles during a seasonal move. More children meant more hands to work the fields later. It also meant more mouths to feed during the months before harvest. Population grew, which required more fields, which required more labor, which supported more children, in a loop that fed itself forward. Once a village's population outgrew what foraging the surrounding land could support, there was no simple way back. The trap had already closed. In 1984, 2 anthropologists set out to settle this argument scientifically, by comparing skeletons directly, and what they found surprised even them. Mark Nathan Cohen and George Armalagos compiled skeletal data from farming and foraging populations across multiple continents in a landmark study. They expected, like most researchers at the time, to find health steadily improving as societies adopted farming. That is not what the bones showed. In population after population, the shift to agriculture lined up with shorter adult height, more dental disease, and more signs of nutritional stress. Average height actually dropped after farming began, in several regions, by several centimeters, a decline that in some populations took thousands of years to fully reverse. In some analyses, humans in parts of Europe didn't regain the average height of their Paleolithic ancestors until the 20th century. That number is difficult to sit with. An achievement we're taught to call progress left a measurable, physical scar on the human body for 10,000 years. The bones weren't lying, and they weren't offering an opinion. They were simply recording what actually happened to the people who lived through it. Villages solved one problem and created another. Living close together came with a hidden biological cost nobody had priced in. At Adel-Hikay, a densely packed settlement in modern Turkey dating to around 7,500 BC, archaeologist Ian Hodder's team found homes built wall to wall, entered through the roof. People lived, cooked, and buried their dead within the same tight walls, alongside penned or nearby livestock, for the first time in human history. That closeness let diseases jump between animals and humans more easily, and let outbreaks spread through a settlement instead of dying out with an isolated band. Waste accumulated, parasites spread. Skeletal remains from early farming villages show far higher rates of infection than remains from nearby foraging groups of the same era. The wall that finally kept out weather and predators also kept disease locked in with everyone breathing the same air. And here is the part almost nobody connects to their breakfast. Grain didn't just feed early states. In many ways, grain built them. Political scientist James C. Scott, at Yale University, argued in his 2017 book that early states relied specifically on grain, not just any food. A tuber growing underground is nearly impossible to tax. Nobody can see it, count it, or confiscate it without digging up an entire field. A field of standing grain is the opposite, visible, countable, harvested all at once, and impossible to hide from an official walking the boundary. That visibility made grain the perfect target for taxation, tribute, and control, turning a food source into a tool of government. Rulers who could tax grain could fund soldiers, monuments, and administrators, converting stored calories directly into political power. Foragers, scattered and mobile, were nearly impossible to govern this way. Farmers, tied to a visible field, were not. In that sense, agriculture didn't only make cities possible, it made the modern relationship between citizens, taxes, and rulers possible too. Once land and grain could be stored, something new became possible that had barely existed before: durable, inheritable wealth. A family with a larger field, a fuller granary, or more livestock could pass that advantage directly to their children, compounding across generations. A family without those things could fall behind permanently, borrowing seed, losing harvests, and becoming dependent on wealthier neighbors. Property lines meant defending property, which meant walls, weapons, and eventually armies, layered directly on top of what used to be open, shared land. Gender roles shifted too. In many farming societies, women's labor became more tied to the household and less to independent foraging, narrowing their economic role. None of this was announced as a rule. It emerged slowly, the same way the farming trap itself emerged, one reasonable decision at a time. But it would be dishonest to stop here, because the surplus that built inequality also built something extraordinary. Stored grain freed some people from spending every hour finding food, which meant, for the first time, some people could specialize in something else entirely. Potters, builders, healers, and record keepers appeared, and with them, writing, mathematics, architecture, and eventually science. Cities that could never have existed on foraging alone rose on the back of stored grain: temples, libraries, irrigation systems, and monuments that still stand today. The same mechanism that built durable inequality also built durable civilization, and separating the two turns out to be almost impossible. That's not a contradiction historians have resolved. It's a tension baked directly into the foundation of almost every society that came after. Which brings us back to that 1987 essay we mentioned earlier, the one that finally said this out loud. Jared Diamond, a physiologist and geographer at UCLA, published an essay in Discover magazine bluntly questioning whether agriculture deserved its reputation as progress. He pointed to the same skeletal evidence, the same lost height, the same new diseases, and asked why textbooks kept calling this an unqualified success. The essay didn't argue foragers lived in paradise. It argued that measuring history only by population size and technology hides how individual lives actually change. More people is not the same as better lives. A system can spread successfully while making day-to-day existence harder for the people living inside it. That distinction didn't stay in the past. It's sitting on your plate today, whether you've noticed it or not. Right now, just 3 crops, wheat, rice, and corn, provide roughly half of all calories consumed by humans on Earth. That concentration makes global food supply incredibly efficient, and also incredibly fragile, the same trade-off early farmers made without knowing its name. A disease, drought, or war affecting one major grain region can still ripple through food prices and availability worldwide, exactly the vulnerability those first fields introduced. Diets built heavily around cheap, starchy staples are also linked today to higher rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes in many populations. The same plant that built cities 12,000 years ago is still, in a very real sense, shaping human bodies today. None of this means every farming society suffered identically. Health outcomes varied enormously by region, climate, crop choice, and local politics. Some early farming settlements stayed healthy for centuries. Others declined quickly. The bones don't support one single verdict for the entire species. Calling farming simply a mistake is too blunt for what the evidence actually shows: an uneven trade, with very different winners and losers. The honest answer sits somewhere between triumph and trap, which is a far less satisfying headline, but a far more accurate one. So the next time you eat something made from wheat, rice, or corn, you're tasting the same bargain humans struck 12,000 years ago. Somewhere in your kitchen, that food is still quietly doing what it has always done, feeding you and tying you to a system built long before you were born. It gave humanity cities, writing, medicine, and eventually the ability to ask this very question about itself. It also gave humanity shorter bones, crowded diseases, taxed harvests, and inequality that still shapes who eats well and who doesn't. Farming didn't end human freedom in one single moment. It may have just quietly turned freedom into something people now have to work for. So, was agriculture humanity's greatest breakthrough, its harshest bargain, or somehow, impossibly, both at once? The bones, so far, refuse to give a simple answer.